Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to present this project with the co-chair of the scientific committee, Dr. David Hodgins here, my colleague. I'll just jump right into it. So I'm gonna start us off and tell you a little bit about the origins of the project, how we got to where we're at, some of the governance of the project, some background and that kind of stuff. I'm going to then hand it off to David, and he will take you through a lot of the science that we used to develop the guidelines. And then he'll hand it back to me, and I'll take you through some of the knowledge mobilization products and some of the things that we have developed to be able to actually have these guidelines make a difference in public health. So, I would like to say to begin with that these guidelines were developed while I was an employee at the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. I still maintain strong connections there, but I have moved on. So though this presentation uses content developed by CCSA while I was there, the views and opinions do not necessarily represent those of CCSA. So this is just what I had just said. So I'll talk a little bit about the background and introduction, and then I'll pass it off to David, and he'll hand it back to me. So to begin with, a little bit about the background of the project. So this was a 4-year, ended up being 5-year project funded by a foundation out of Quebec in Canada called the Fondation Mise sur Toi. The CCSA, who historically doesn't do a ton of work in gambling, did take on the project because of its role in developing Canada's low-risk alcohol drinking guidelines, as well as a number of other factors. So I guess a good place to begin is why lower risk gambling guidelines. So one of the things that we know in the field, for many of you who know the field quite well, is when we try and give people we've got to give people advice about how to gamble in a way that is that lowers or lessens the risk of harms associated with gambling, or the advice we give is kind of non-specific and kind of vague. So we say only bet amounts you can afford to lose, take breaks on a regular basis, etc. We don't really have any kind of specific numbers that we can provide people to help guide their behavior. So that was kind of the essence of this project. Now, we do know that we do have these kinds of guidelines in other areas. So for example, in Canada, we legalized cannabis about a couple of years ago now. So we do have Canada's low risk cannabis use guidelines. So these include advice to people about how to use cannabis in a way that lowers the risk of health harms to themselves and others. There are also other guidelines which are a bit more removed from cannabis guidelines, but they're guidelines nonetheless. And so we have a Canada's Food Guide, which provides guidance on people how to have how to eat in a balanced way, and in a way that promotes health. Probably the closest example to the low risk gambling guidelines is the low risk alcohol drinking guidelines, and these are many countries have these guidelines. Australia, the UK, and Canada has these guidelines, and these are based on the assessment of the risks associated with various levels of consumption of alcohol, and health outcomes, as well as other kinds of acute injuries and kind of chronic conditions like alcohol-related cancers. And these are fairly well known and have been very useful in trying to just really develop a culture of moderation, to give people advice about how to consume alcohol in a way that lessens the risk associated with their drinking. So now what we have is we have developed these lower risk gambling guidelines using very similar kinds of methods, and which David will take you through a lot of that. But to begin with, I think we'll start at the end, and we'll just show you what the guidelines are. So after 5 years of work and all the work that David is going to take you through, these really are the guidelines. And so we have how much, so 1, and so this is gamble no more than 1% of your household income before tax per month. How often? Gamble no more than 4 days per month. and how many avoid regularly gambling at more than 2 types of games. So this is kind of the poster that's available at the website gamblingguidelines.ca. And this poster kind of really just includes all the pieces that are really the essence of the guidelines. What we have here is we have a description of what are the different various types of gambling and what they include. We have a description describing what you play matters. So different kinds of games are going to make it more or less likely that you're going to adhere to the guidelines. And then down below here, we have a box describing what some of the research has shown to us are some information about, that if these things apply to you, you might consider less than these guidelines recommend or not at all. So these are if you experience problems from alcohol, cannabis, or drug use, or experience anxiety or depression, or have a personal or family history of problems with gambling. Also included on this poster are a number of other pieces of information. We have safer gambling tips. These were drawn from the academic and peer-reviewed literature, as well as some of the work that we did to develop this project. We also have some information that some of our focus groups, some of the research we did for the project indicated it was important to provide people some guidance about what is meant by, so what are the harms associated with gambling? And really, this is more of a broad public health-based approach. So certainly one of the harms is, is kind of more that kind of a dependency or gambling disorder, but there are also a lot of other lower, not addiction-related harms that are associated with gambling in quantities above the guidelines we suggest. So we talk about this here. We say losing money is a gambling harm that first comes to mind, but gambling can lead to other harms: relationship conflicts, emotional distress, health problems. And finally, we talk about thinking about the reasons for your gambling. So before I hand it off to David, I can just give you kind of like the kind of the sales pitch about why that you trust these guidelines, and why these guidelines are really the result of a very rigorous effort to develop them. So we had these were a result of oversight by a scientific working group. We conducted risk curve analysis of over 60,000 people who gamble from 8 different countries who participated. This was an international effort. We did domestic research within Canada of over 10,000 Canadians. We also conducted interviews and focus groups with Canadians, over 50 people across Canada who gamble, conducted 2 comprehensive literature reviews, which are one of which is published in an academic journal right now. And we collaborated with an international group of experts made up of some of the top gambling researchers in the world. So with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague, David, who can take you through some of the descriptions of how they were developed.
Thank you, Matthew. And yes, I'm also very pleased to be here this afternoon to talk about this project, which we're very fond of. So I'm going to walk you through the science and hopefully do it in a kind and gentle way. Do you want to advance, Matthew? As Matthew said, he and I co-chaired a scientific working group that really focused on the science of the project. And at the same time, there was a parallel advisory committee that was made up of stakeholders. So people with lived experience, regulators, providers, public health people, clinicians, and they were sort of apprised of kind of the evolution of the project throughout the project, and were able to kind of, I guess, prepare us for kind of best ways to disseminate the information. So the science was kind of separate from the advocacy part of it. These are the other members of the scientific working group: Sean Curry from the University of Calgary, Magali Dufour, Louise Nadeau, Natasha Brunel from the province of Quebec, and then a couple of additional people from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, including Catherine Paradis, who was very central in developing the low-risk alcohol guidelines, which was very helpful. Next slide. So we developed an action plan that had, a series of steps, and this was actually a published document, so you can kind of see that we planned how we were going to approach the project, essentially taking an existing methodology that involves using existing data from prevalence surveys and developing risk curves to see at what levels of involvement with gambling does the risk of harm begin to increase. Next slide. So the first, challenge we had then was, what do we mean by harm? There's a variety of different ways you can conceptualize harm in gambling. It's different than harm in alcohol, where you have maybe a physical harm that you can focus on. And we, based on looking at what was available in databases and also using a conceptual model that was a very impressive model that was developed in Australia, we established that we were going to look at looking at the risk of harm, financial harm, relationship harms, emotional distress, and health problems. And essentially what we ended up doing was, in each of the databases we used, the Problem Gambling Severity Index had been administered, and we used specific items from that scale as the indicators of harm that we were looking to prevent. Next slide. So yeah, next slide. So as I mentioned, the goal was to find existing data sets where we could do this risk curve analysis. And when we say risk curve, essentially this is the type of examination we would make of a database. As you can see along the bottom, there's some sort of indicator of involvement with gambling. And in this example, it's how many days per month did a person gamble. And on the other axis is the proportion of the sample that were experiencing harm. And here there are three different harm indicators plotted. But you can see that that there's a point of uptick where the risk of harm begins to increase. And we can look at this statistically to identify where is the point, the tipping point in terms of where the risk of harm begins to increase. And you'll see more specifically what I mean in a moment here. So we looked worldwide for data sets that we could use with this type of analysis that are good quality, either cross-sectional data sets or longitudinal data sets. So cross-sectional surveys where it was a one-time measurement, or longitudinal where people were measured, gambling was measured over a time period. And we found 11 different data sets in 8 different countries that seemed appropriate. And we approached the individuals associated with these projects, with these data sets. And to a person, everyone was very enthusiastic about becoming partners in this project. So these are the countries. You can see that there's 3 different data sets from Canada. There's one from the United States, so your Massachusetts longitudinal study, a data set from Iceland, one from Sweden, one from Finland, one from France, one from Australia, and one from New Zealand. So pretty diverse in some senses, but limited in other senses, because we have no Asian countries, no South American or African countries. Next slide. So basically, we got together and kind of worked out the methodological details of how we might approach this. And one of the questions was, well, what indicators of gambling do we have in each of the data sets? And we had, well, there were potentially 4. There were 3 actually that in the end worked out. There was expenditure. So the percentage of gross monthly income spent on gambling in a month, or actually just the dollar amount as well, frequency of gambling, and then the number of different gambling types played in the past year. And all of the data sets had these variables in them. Next slide. Yeah, and as I mentioned previously, they all included the problem gambling severity index, and we use those items as our harm indicators. Okay, next. So basically, everybody went off to their home country and did some analysis and sent them to us. And we had reams and reams of these risk curves, and these are examples. So this is on the left-hand side here, you'll see some data from Canada, from Alberta and Ontario, where what is plotted here is the number of days gambled in a month at the initial assessment. And then along the y-axis is the percentage of the population that were experiencing a type of harm. And again, there were three plot. Actually, if you just want to go back, Matthew, for a second, you can see that there is a place on these graphs where there's an uptick. And that's what we were looking at. And we kind of looked at them all. And now you can go ahead, quite amazingly, what we found was generally the shape of all the curves were similar, but actually to our surprise, that the places of uptick, the best limits, were actually quite similar across these very different data sets, across the indicators, across different countries. And from that, we then derived what some, somewhat broad ranges of lower risk guidelines would be. So for expenditure, if you convert it to Canadian dollars, it was $60 to $120 per month. Percentage of income, it was 1% to 3%. Frequency, it was 5 to 8 days per month. Number of gambling types, it was 3 or 4 a month. And we also looked at duration of gambling, and that just wasn't reliable. So we eliminated that from the guidelines. So the next. So we also then asked all of our partners to provide with us information about the risk, the relative risk of harm compared to a low frequency gambler or a low gambler, a very light gambler, for different potential cut points. And I won't kind of go into the details of this, but this was sort of part of what helped us refine more specifically what we thought were the best cutoffs or indicators or limits for lower risk gambling. So I'll move ahead, Matthew, from this one. Okay, so that was kind of the research that we did that was really focused on using quantitative existing data to come up with guidelines. We also, though, had a series of other research projects that we used to help validate and refine specifically what our ultimate message would be. And I'm going to sort of quickly review some of these other pieces of research, which I think were very helpful in informing the specifics of the guidelines. So we conducted 2 literature reviews. One was specifically focused on the effect of substance use on gambling. And the second one was focused on looking at what the factors were that are associated with increased risk of gambling. So basically, what are the correlates of developing gambling problems? And then we also participated in a survey of over 10,000 Canadians who gamble, where we were able to get from them their opinions and advice about lower risk guidelines. So if you'd like to go ahead, Matthew. And then the third was that we did some qualitative work where we did interviews and focus groups with different people who gamble at different levels, really across Canada, and a number of different places across Canada, to get their feedback and input into what they would see as reasonable. So next slide. So that first literature review was, as I mentioned, on the effect of substance use on gambling behavior. And basically, from a research perspective, what the literature shows is that there is a clear comorbidity or clear association between people who are involved problematically with gambling and substance use issues. And we know that, there's a comorbidity of substance use and gambling problems. But what was more limited and what we were interested in specifically for this project was, well, what's the effect of actually gambling, drinking while you're gambling, or using drugs while you're gambling? And does that have implications for the kind of advice you'd want to give people? And that information is actually very limited if you look at what's available in the research. Next slide. So the second literature review was looking at the correlates of gambling problems. And this was a large meta-analysis where we identified basically all of the prevalent surveys that we could find that measured different correlates of problem gambling. And what we found was that the type of gambling the category of variables indicating a type of gambling were the ones that were most strongly associated with the risk of gambling problems. So if you're looking at the strongest correlates of problem gambling, it's the type of gambling that a person is doing. But then there were other variables that were also both significant and had a reasonable size effect that we might want to consider if we're giving public health advice around gambling. So if you want to go ahead, Matthew. So this is just an example, and we can certainly provide a full table, but we identified 17 factors that we would want to somehow include in public health advice. And so just as an example, this distraction from everyday problems, the surveys that measured basically using gambling to escape found a very strong association with problem gambling, and that wouldn't surprise many of you. And so you'll see when we go back and look at the guidelines, how we've tried to incorporate that into the advice that is provided to people, and then problems due to alcohol and drugs and so forth. So the third then was a survey of Canadians that 10,000 people who gamble regularly, from light gamblers to problematic gamblers. And we had a couple of objectives. One was we just asked people to tell us how they controlled their gambling. And we also then provided them with examples of some of our early versions of the guidelines to see if they understood them, whether they found them as reasonable or too high, too low, and so forth, and whether they would use them. Go ahead. So in terms of the strategies that people use without instruction, naturally, most people said that they set predetermined spending limits. They kept track of the money they spent. They limited their alcohol consumption. So those were the major strategies that people reported that they used without instruction. Actually, go to the next slide, Matthew. So we then, also provided them some examples of some of the ways that we might try to communicate different guidelines based on some of our early results with these broader ranges. And this is an example. So we provided them this example, and then we asked them questions about that. So if you go to the next one, Matthew. Actually, we provided them two examples. The first one that I just showed you was the lower range of the limit. So 4 days per month and 1% of income. And this one was a little bit higher. So 6 days per month and 1.5% of income. Next slide. And so the general guideline was that the sample of 10,000 people who gamble really preferred the more conservative end of the continuum of the range. So specifically 4 days per month and 1% of household income. which for in Canadian dollars for the average Canadian is about $60 per month. So this is, these are some of the results that would show that. So basically people were asked, given these two examples, a higher one, a lower one, so 4 days or 6 days per month, and they were asked to rate whether this was very much too high, a little too high, just right, a little too low, very much too low, or whether they just didn't understand it. And you can see that the light blue, the 4 days per month, proportionally more people thought that that was pretty good. They felt that the 6 days a month was a little bit too high. So we incorporated that type of information into our final set of guidelines. And the next one, so this is the percentage of income one. Again, a lower one was presented as an example, a higher one was presented as an example, and there was a preference about the use of a preference for the lower range of the guideline. Next one. Focus groups, we really did something similar with the focus groups, but of course we were able to have much more detailed discussions with people about how they understand strategies to control gambling, and then their specific opinions about the gambling. I'm going to go to the next one. We did 9 focus groups and 5 individual interviews in Montreal, Calgary, and Toronto, in both English and French, with people who gambled regularly. Next. And so this was some of the advice that we got from the focus groups. They liked the idea that we, that we would be providing advice around percentage of income, but they, not surprisingly said, well, that's really hard to calculate. Like for me personally, I'm not sure how I would calculate that and so forth. So you can see in the guidelines, we've tried to incorporate a little graph to kind of help people make that calculation for themselves. They asked, the third point here is they really asked for clarification on, what do you mean by gambling? Like types of gambling, what does that mean? And also, what do you mean by gambling harm? There was a tendency to think that what we were talking about was gambling addiction, and we weren't. We were really looking at, harm, financial harm, relationship harm, emotional harm, health harms. So they were looking for more information about specifically what the lower risk guidelines were attempting to prevent. And you'll see how we've incorporated that information. Next. Okay, so I'm going to pass it back to Matthew, and he's going to go back and show you again what the guidelines are, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of see how we've, where different components of the guidelines have come from a research perspective. Matthew?
Thanks, David. So I'll go back to this poster again. So this is the poster that really encapsulates the lower risk gambling guidelines. It kind of has all the essential component pieces to it. We do have other posters that I'll take you through in a second. But as I showed you before, this is really what the guidelines are all about. So as you can see in the top part, we have 1, 4, and 2, which are the quantitative limits that David described. And so this is 1% of household income. This is the chart that David was talking about when one of the things that people, I remember, I've heard this myself, and you probably have heard it too, is, people will say, if you give them a dollar amount, they say, well, but if Bill Gates can gamble with more and he's not going to experience harm, or Alex Bezos, or any, so though a stable dollar amount was easier to communicate, it wouldn't be seen as credible. So we have this is in Canadian dollars, at least, this is the amount of the yearly household income, and then a maximum daily amount, kind of like a cheat sheet. So you can look to see what that means for you. We also see that we have the and is really important here. So these are all ands, right? So it's 1% of household income per month, 4 days per month, and no more 2 types of games per month. The other issue down here is David indicated that people didn't know necessarily what was meant by gambling and what was meant by gambling types. And so we have some images here and some icons down here to kind of impart that that concept to people kind of visually. And then finally, we have what you play matters here. And this is really kind of comes from a bit of the systematic review that really showed that that one of the biggest predictors of problematic gambling was the kinds of games people were engaged in. So it really is, and it really kind of came down to the fact that it was fast-paced games that involve quick and repeated betting lead more quickly to problems. And it really, for us, it's a description of if you gamble at some types of games, make it harder for you to adhere to the guidelines. So I will.
Oh, you're muted, Matthew. Yeah.
No, my apologies. I was just asking my family to keep quiet because I got 2 young kids. It's the problem, the challenges of presenting from home at a conference. They just came home from school and I don't know, they're doing something. It's the virtual conferences. We also have underneath here, this section down here that I'm circling around also comes from the systematic review. And these are the kind of risk factors and special risk populations and the people for whom the gambling guidelines may not apply, or the people who are gambling in this fashion should consider gambling less than they recommend or not at all. And then we have, as I described before, the safer gambling tips and negative consequences related to gambling. So this is the main poster, but we also have a bunch of other products that are available for you to download and use if you want to use them to incorporate the gambling guidelines into your health promotion activities. One of them here is another poster. This is on gambling harms. And so this is really just a poster, just simply describes what we mean by gambling harms and is meant to address the issue that David was talking about, where it's not addiction or not problem gambling that is the main outcome that we're targeting. It's really those upstream or early harms associated with high levels of gambling involvement. So this talks about gambling harms. Losing money is the gambling harm that first comes to mind, but gambling can also lead to other harms. And so there's a bit of a description and some more information in this kind of pictogram or infographic. Another one goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that some games make it harder to adhere to the guidelines. So this is another poster that tries to lay that out to people so that they understand, and then reminds people at the bottom what the gambling guidelines are. Another poster that we have really describes to people that, you know, some people are more likely to experience harms from gambling. And so this comes from the systematic review. So specifically, it indicates down on the side, if you experience problems with anxiety, depression, problems from alcohol, cannabis, or other drug use, or have a personal family history of problems with gambling, or gamble to escape problems, you should consider gambling less than these guidelines recommend or not at all. Also, so all of this is available at the website I mentioned earlier, so www.gamblingguidelines.ca. There's also a bunch of social media promotional products there that you can share on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The website has all the materials that you're interested in, as well as a kind of a report detailing the science behind it and a short report. Also on that site too is a page that one of the things we really tried. It was really important to the scientific working group that all of the work that was done to develop these guidelines was the most rigorous and scientific possible. And so in order to do that, as we went through the process, we continually wrote up our findings and submitted them to peer-reviewed scientific publications. And so this page here really outlines all the publications that have come out and led to this work. There are some that are have been submitted for publication, so haven't necessarily been accepted yet. But this page on the website will have a description of all of those, all the papers that are either have been accepted and published or are in the process of being peer reviewed. And this is the website that includes all of the materials that we just went through. So I think with that, we can open it up to the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew and David. I want to start just by asking, now, my understanding was this was rolled out in September. Is that correct? In some of the provinces, if not, are they, so it's available to anyone in Canada? I mean, have most of the provinces picked up on this?
Well, it's available to anyone in the world. We tried, even though we called the presentation Canada's guidelines, that we avoided that they're not labeled as Canada's guidelines anywhere throughout, because we wanted them to make them open and available. Now, the mandate of the project was really just to develop the guidelines and develop the knowledge mobilization products associated with it. So we haven't really had any opportunity yet to really try and work with partners to integrate them into their responsible gambling programs or public health engagements, because they just came out a month and a half, or well, 2 months ago now. So really these are kind of an offering up there, and it's the hope that many of the people on this call or others will take them and work with them. We do have an option to be able to take any of those products, and we encourage people to either take them, download them, print them off, and just disseminate them, or even if there's an interest in adapting them. Like, I know, for example, colleagues in Australia are interested in them, but they don't call them electronic gaming machines; they call them pokies. And so there's an effort to look to see, how do these resonate with Australians, and how might we adapt them to change the language to pokies instead of electronic gaming machines. There's some other partners in Finland who are looking to see whether or not they can translate them to Finnish. So it's really like, they're kind of like a open source. I mean, no, open source means you can muck with the programming. You can't muck with the programming, but they're open. They're open to be used, for people to use them. And we would really, that's our hope.
Yeah, and just to extend that, I mean, I think, the hope really is that people will use them in a way, that they'll actually rebrand them so that it fits within their own ways of doing public health work in this area. And so that, that's what's happened with the low risk alcohol guidelines. So they were produced nationally, and then provinces kind of pick them up and, incorporate them into their own campaigns and their own materials, and, with their own branding. And so that's the offer. And that's a process that, unrolls over time. I know in my province, the regulator folks are really looking very seriously at this, but, it needs to fit into their timeline for when they will be developing new materials. And, they're all caught up in COVID kinds of issues, and there's lots of reasons that it's going to take a little bit of time, but that's the vision, and it's really the process is set up so that organizations can very easily get what they need to take those steps to incorporate and disseminate the guidelines.
So we do have some questions. Do you have any thoughts on how problem gambling providers could use this data to help determine what type of gambler may or may not be a promising candidate for LRGG strategies?
That's a very good question. And I have two parts to my answer to that. One is, I guess, a reminder that these guidelines are really aimed at the general public, not at people who have gambling problems, right? So they're really meant to help, individuals who want to gamble, who like to gamble, to think about how they're gambling and maybe prevent problems. Now, that having been said, they are potentially a clinical tool in the same sense that low risk drinking guidelines can be a tool. So, somebody comes into your office and they are not sure if they want to stop gambling or they want to cut back gambling. As part of that encouragement for them to think about that, you can have a discussion with them. Well, this is what the guidelines are in terms of staying safe. How would that work for you? How would that fit for you? And for many individuals, if it's the same as it is for alcohol, they would kind of look at these and say, well, I'm not interested in limiting my gambling that much. Or that you can set those goals and have them experiment and have them discover for themselves whether or not it's realistic and feasible that they stay within those guidelines. So I think there's a clinical use for them, and that's a little bit untested, but up until now we haven't had that, right? So when you've had those people who are unsure what their goals are, we didn't really have this tool to kind of help direct a discussion and an investigation, and hopefully have the client kind of come to a realistic goal for themselves.
So other than, obviously this is geared towards the public, and as an upstream, upstream prevention method, do you know of anyone who's doing anything that you find particularly intriguing with the information at this point? Granted, it's only been open for 2 months, but have you seen anything yet that has kind of piqued your interest in terms of how they're running with it?
I mean, we haven't had an opportunity really for that, for the seeds to grow and sprout yet. I mean, I can tell you one of the things that is being developed right now is kind of like what we're calling a risk assessment tool. So that's when people can go on to the Gambling Guidelines website. It hasn't been put out yet, so it's still in development, where people can go on and they're asked a few questions, and they can answer the questions about their gambling involvement and their household income, all anonymously. And then the tool will give them back feedback about their risk of different harms. So that's a useful thing for people to check. If they're wondering about their gambling anonymously, they can go and they can just check that, and just to see. Because one of the things that's always like, I've spent a fair amount of time working in substance use field, and one of the things that we saw is you tend to kind of compare to other people in your peer group, and if you hang around people who drink and people who gamble, you can have kind of skewed views of what is kind of a basic level of drinking or of gambling, right? So I don't drink that much because I only drink a 6-pack a night, but because my roommate drinks 12 a night or something, like these kinds of, and there's no kind of standard level just to say, well, what is a kind of reasonable level of gambling? What is a kind of a base level of lower risk gambling? So I think injecting this into the public discourse and the narrative is really helpful. Just to, it doesn't mean that somebody is a terrible human being if they go over the guidelines. They just need to know that when they do, they're at risk. It's kind of like with Canada's food guide. Fast food is not included in Canada's food guide, but people will eat that once in a while, but they know that there's health risks associated with that, and if you do it a lot, it's problematic. So, it helps to kind of just to, I think, moderate the discussion and to understand where the line is in terms of what is a kind of a lower risk gambling level for people to kind of to aim to do it as a general rule.
Yeah, and we just unrolled a comparative tool today. So people who visit that tool will get some feedback. They'll get the survey information, a small report indicating, how they compare to other Minnesotans, and if they tend to be on the more problematic side of the spectrum, they'll get a richer report with more information and tips and those kinds of things. I wonder too, so it uses 1% of their pre-tax income as kind of the measure. And it seemed that people were very comfortable with that. I wondered in the conversations in the focus groups, was it viewed that their gambling was a form of entertainment, and is 1% typically what people would spend if they went out to the movies or went out to dinner? Was there any kind of comparisons made with that when you were within the focus groups?
Do you want to try?
Yeah, I thought maybe you were going to jump in, Matthew, because I know you actually attended some of the focus groups, which I didn't. But that was part of the discussion, but I don't think it was one of the central themes that we were looking to have people discuss. I mean, we were really wanting to understand whether people understood the concepts and whether they saw them as credible. And so we didn't really look at how their gambling expenditures kind of were related to their other discretionary income kind of indicators. But the 1% kind of falls within other research, information from other research that suggests that that's a reasonable amount of discretionary income for entertainment purposes.
And
oh, go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, I was just going to add to that too. And I mean, one of the things that did come up both from since we rolled out the guidelines and then also sometimes in the focus groups was this idea of discretionary income or what you can afford to spend. But from our perspective as kind of looking at the risk curves and the epidemiology and everything, it was very difficult to get at that and to define that. And so really when you see the stability of the curves are really based on just percentage of base income. And it's difficult to define what discretionary income is. So, I mean, I think your question is really good. And I think probably the reason we pause is that it's a very important conversation, but it's very difficult to turn into and operationalize into specific figures and then have data attached to it. So all we know is that if people gambling over that amount are at higher risk of gambling related harms. You could probably look at similar kinds of calculations for other kinds of activities and then define harms and then look at those things, but that wasn't this exercise. And in the end too, like alcohol, the reason we did this for gambling is that idea that gambling is no ordinary commodity similar to alcohol. It is a commodity or an activity that is very problematic for some people, and therefore we need to kind of deal with it a little bit differently than going to the movies or shopping or things like that. We need to we say, here's a way to do it. Here's a way to do it that lowers the risk of experiencing harms.
Okay. And I know, again, it's early on in the life of this, but are you aware of conversations with operators at this point? We know that many of the provinces have responsible gambling programs at the casinos and such. And I just wondered if you've had any conversations at this point as to how that might be rolled in to existing responsible gambling programs.
Yeah, so you're right. In most Canadian casinos, there are responsible gambling services and typically a location where people can get information and personnel associated with that location. And part of the use for these materials is really through for use by those personnel as sort of educational materials. But more than that, the hope is that that these will be incorporated into the operation and the offerings of gambling. So if people are either offered or mandated the opportunity to set personal limits on their gambling, it would be very nice to see these guidelines as part of the discussion or the options for people is, maybe these should be the default guidelines that are set, and people can adjust them according to their own desires, for example. So the idea has been discussed. I'm not aware of where it's been taken up to date. We're doing some interesting work with a European provider, online gambling provider, and looking at risk, whether it can be used to help identify among people who are gambling online the levels of problematic involvement. And certainly the discussions around doing that are for that purpose, is, perhaps this could be used in that way. So it's a little bit theoretical at this point, unfortunately, but we're moving in that direction.
It would seem that particularly online, that there are opportunities to build in such tools. I mean, I don't know how to write code and do any of that, but it seems that it would be nice. I mean, that I think is one of the brighter sides of moving things more online, that there's the opportunity to do more monitoring for those that really are indicating problematic behavior, and to be able to do some interventions along that line, and to allow people, particularly in the early stages, to maybe set limits and see how that goes. Let's see, just want to refresh my questions here to make sure I'm capturing everybody. We got a few comments about just being admiring the Canadian system and the idea that it's that problem gambling is looked at as a public health issue, which is not always the case in the States, and that you've overall there are some very good tools that have been created. So some appreciation there, and I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure what that question is, so I'll just kind of bypass that. But any other, any closing remarks that you want to make at this point? What, in terms of your involvement with the tool, what do you see happening going forward?
Well, the reality is that we received some very generous funding to do the project to this point, and we've kind of fulfilled the mandate of that funding, and it's not totally clear kind of what's going to happen from here. So we've provided this product and these opportunities, and we've had some nibbles on people who would like to either take it to look at different aspects of it, or even partner with us in doing that. So Matthew talked about folks in Finland, for example, and we're in contact with them and trying to help them as they move to look at validating the guidelines in their country. So I guess we're looking for opportunities, but there are no specific plans, because this particular project, has fulfilled its mandate and has ended.
So
yeah, and maybe to
go ahead.
I was gonna say, maybe to add on to that, like we just released them about, like you said, about a month or 2 months ago, and so we're kind of just catching our breath. But I would say that that if anybody on the line is interested in taking any steps and we can assist or provide any support in doing so, or ideas, or collaborate on grants, or do any of that sort, please reach out to David and I. We can like like this. That's the whole goal of this, was to put it out into the public space and to make it and to make a difference. So we'll do anything we can to help anybody on the line take those next steps, and if it requires kind of trying to seek out some funding opportunities, we could do that. If it requires just advising on some work being done inside your own organization, we can do that. Just please reach out. We would welcome any kind of discussion, further discussion about how these can be used.
Well, it really is a very interesting take, and I think it will be interesting to see how it does play out over time, and how different organizations are using it, and you know, with great hope that when people see it, that it will at least, you know, cause them to be more aware of what their activities are, and hopefully minimize the harm that they could potentially experience.